People of Reddit, what's your crazy traumatic family story? I don't talk about this much. Hell, I hardly talk about it at all. But today, I don't know. I feel like I have to. Maybe it's because something in me still hasn't let go. Maybe it's because that night the night everything changed still haunts me. And I think it always will. I was just a kid, 7 or 8, when the cracks in my family started to show. Before that, it was different. Before first grade, things weren't perfect, but they were. Normal, in a way. My mom used to smile at me every morning. Not a big, bright smile, but a soft one. The kind that made me feel like maybe we were okay. Like maybe there was still some good in her, despite everything. She had these tired-eyed eyes that always seemed a little sad. Even when she tried to hide it, but I loved her with everything I had. She was my mom, and I think I always tried to make her proud, even though I didn't always know how. And my dad, well, he wasn't a monster when I was little. Not at first. I mean, he wasn't exactly a warm guy, but he wasn't cruel, not like he would be later. He would pick me up sometimes and toss me around, laughing. It felt good when he laughed back then, like maybe he really cared. He wasn't a gentle father, but he was there. I remember sitting on the porch, watching him fix the car, his hands greasy but steady. He wasn't the kind of dad who'd sit down and talk with me for hours, but sometimes he'd let me hand him a wrench or sit by his side as he smoked a cigarette. I was his kid, and that was enough for him, I guess. But even back then, I could see the shadows in him. He didn't talk about his father much, but when he did, it was with this coldness, this bitterness that never really went away. His dad had been a drunk really bad. Wouldn't come home for days, passed out in alleys or bars, only to show up stinking of whiskey and regret. And his mother? She was something else entirely. She was more ghost than person, always lost in her pills and heroin. Her eyes glazed, her voice hollow. He'd tell me, like it was some kind of excuse, that he'd never had a chance to learn how to be a father, because no one had taught him. But he never seemed to see how that made it worse. I didn't get it at the time, but looking back, I think maybe he wasn't just angry at the world. He was angry because he never had a chance to grow up right, and somehow that anger just grew inside him. And one day, when I was about 7, it started to spill out. I didn't know what happened. Maybe it was just the first grade. Maybe it was the fact that I was getting older and I was his responsibility. But the first time he hit my mom, I was too young to understand what was happening. All I knew was that there were tears in her eyes and blood on her lip, and I was terrified. My dad had always been big, but when he raised his hand to her that first time, I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why my mom was so scared of him and why he was so angry. I just remember trying to make myself small, to disappear into the corner of the room, so that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't notice me. But he did. He always did. From that day forward, it just kept getting worse. My mom would cry all the time, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, wherever she thought he couldn't hear. And when I was old enough to understand, I'd hear her whispering into the phone to a friend, "It's fine. He didn't mean it. It's just a bad day." I don't know how many times she said that. Maybe hundreds. Maybe more. But I knew what was happening. I'd see the bruises. I'd see the way she tried to hide them. The way she wore scarves or long sleeves in summer to cover up the marks that never seemed to fade. And I remember asking her once, "Why don't you leave, Mom? Why don't you just leave him?" And she just looked at me with this broken kind of look, her eyes tired, like she didn't even know the answer anymore. She'd always say, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." But I wasn't angry at her. I wasn't angry at my mom. I was angry at him. My dad. The man who was supposed to protect us, who was supposed to make things better, not worse. I think at first, I just wanted to fix things. I wanted to somehow make him stop hurting her. But the older I got, the more I realized there was no fixing it. Not with him. Not with the man who'd been broken by his own father and grandfather, who had never learned how to be any better than they were. And the worst part was that I couldn't even run. Where would I go? Then, one night, it all came to a head. I'll never forget it. I was lying in bed, trying to block out the shouting, when I heard it, the slap. The sickening sound of skin against skin. I had heard it 1,000 times before, but this time it was different. This time, I felt something snap inside me. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just lie there. I couldn't let it happen again. I crept to the hallway, barely breathing, heart thundering in my chest. When I looked into their room, I saw him with her pinned against the wall, his hand raised, his face twisted with rage. He wasn't even speaking words anymore, just these guttural sounds of fury. My mom was crying, begging him to stop, but it was like she was talking to a wall. And I could see the fear in her eyes, the helplessness. That's when I saw it. My mom's hand, trembling, shaking, holding a gun. I didn't know what was happening. I couldn't understand how she could have a gun. She'd always told me guns were for bad people. But there she was, standing there, holding it like it was her last lifeline. She wasn't crying anymore. She just stared at him, at my dad, as if she had nothing left to lose. And then, bang. I froze. The sound of the gunshot was like a slap, like it hit me just as hard as it hit him. My father stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock, his hands clutching at his chest as blood started to seep out. He didn't fall immediately. He didn't die right away. For a moment, he just stood there, gasping for air, looking at me like he was trying to say something. His mouth moved, but the words didn't come. And then I heard him speak, weakly, but clear enough to make my heart stop. You think? You think this is it? He gasped, choking on his own blood. You think you're safe now? This is just the beginning. And then he died, right there in front of me. His body slumped, his eyes going blank, and the room was still, so still. My mom didn't even move. She just stood there, holding the gun, shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't move either. I couldn't speak. I just watched. Watched the blood spread across the floor. Watched my mom crumble to her knees, whispering over and over, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. The police came and my mom was arrested, but I think we all knew, deep down, she was just as much a victim as I was. She was a broken woman, pushed too far, just like he had been. But here's the thing, I can't ever forget what still eats at me. Even now, is what they found later, hidden in the crawl space of our house. A second gun. A different one. It wasn't hers. My father didn't just snap. He planned it. He set her up to make it look like self-defense, knowing exactly what would happen. He knew. And in those last moments, when he looked at me, I think he was trying to tell me something. I think he knew too, that he had passed it on, that I was his son. And those words, they haunt me every day. This is just the beginning. What did he mean by that? What did he see for me?